Now, while it was Americans who forced Japan to open its doors politically, in a sense, and to trade, the first representatives of Western comic art are going to be from Britain and France, respectively. So there was a man named Charles Workman, who was from Britain, and he was a journalist working for a British newspaper, and that's in fact why he came to Japan in the first place, was to act as kind of the contact person there, to get information there, the correspondent who would find information from Japan and write up articles and send them back so they could be published in this British newspaper. He was also an artist, an illustrator. And what he did then was he developed his own comic magazine called the Japan Punch. And this is because there is a British magazine with a similar name. And so he was kind of copying that. But he made this Japanese produced comic magazine. And you can see there, I think it's a very interesting image of the samurai with a pen, writing brush in his belt rather than a sword. Right? And you can see it says published in Yokohama. That was a town where there was a lot of trade going on between Japanese people and the West. So it's really, I think, a delightful image. And of course, Japanese people are going to be exposed to that. Right? We saw in those images earlier that Japanese and Western people are coming into contact with each other. And Japanese people are interested in what the West is bringing, including things like this comic here. And you can see there's the rising sun behind with Mount Fuji in front of the sun. So I think very interesting stuff. Another important person who's bringing Western comic art to Japan is a man named George Bogo. And Bogo was from France. And I think he's an interesting guy. You can see there in the lower left, he decided to dress like a samurai. He even had his hair cut like a samurai with the kind of top part here cut off. I'm not doing this look like a samurai. I'm just losing my hair. But I think it's interesting that he would do that. And interestingly enough, both he and Bergman would marry Japanese women. But he was very interested and taken by Japanese tradition. And because of that, he was familiar with Toba. Remember I showed you that image of Abbot Toba, his wonderful animal comic of Buddhism. Well, George Bogo was very impressed by Toba's art and formed a magazine called Toba-e. So remember ukiyo-e, the A meant drawing. Well, Toba-e means drawings connected to Toba, right? So he was honoring that Japanese artist. And his journal, Toba-e, would use a lot of Western style technology. He's going to incorporate Western printing techniques and help introduce them to Japanese people. And of course, Bergman and Bogo are going to publish these journals. And not only are Japanese people going to be interested in the art style, they're also going to be interested in the technology for how they're being printed. And they'll start developing their own kind of journals based around that. Now, you can see Bogo in part because he treasured Japanese tradition. In that image on the left, you can see he's dressed in a Japanese style. On the right, he's poking fun at Japanese who are trying to Westernize, right? You can see that Japanese man and woman looking kind of awkward in Western style clothing. They look in the mirror and they look like a monkey and a dog, right? That's kind of the idea here. He's poking fun at Japanese people trying to be like Western people. Now, one thing that Bogo could do was he could also make statements about politics. There you can see basically that's a policeman who got a copy of Toba-e and he's telling these editors, hey, you're not allowed to draw stuff like this. What happens to this Toba-e? All those men who are gagged and tied up, those are Japanese editors. And they're being told, don't be like this Toba-e guy. Don't be like this Bogo guy who's doing these drawings and making fun of stuff politically. You guys aren't allowed to do that. He can get away with it because he's a foreigner. And you can see him there in the back kind of laughing at the whole scene. Now, we have to note then what this indicates is that while Bogo may have had some freedom to engage in politics, you didn't do that as much in Japan if you were a Japanese person. So don't think that Japanese people don't have any freedom, but they're not going to have as much freedom as people had in the West to critique the government. Right? So if you're a Japanese newspaper editor, you can get in trouble for this. And that's going to be kind of a limitation on the development of Japanese popular culture in this period. So I do need to give you some examples of how the Japanese are adopting all these things. So a man named Kinikichiro Honda, you can see that him here, or I'm sorry, rather his magazine here, he's going to publish a Japanese magazine using Western printing techniques. And he actually worked, I believe it was for Bogo on Toba-e, and learned from him how to produce these things, how to make this stuff, right? How to print things like the Japan or like the Western people do. On the right, he has made a comic that does have a kind of political statement, and he's not going to get in trouble for this particular comic because it didn't go too far. But in this comic, basically, there are, on the right, those are dogs who represent government officials. On the left is a higher government official telling them how to fight cholera. It's a disease, right? A very serious disease. And basically what the dogs are doing is they're just repeating what that official is telling them. And I think the joke is that maybe they're just repeating it without really understanding. And then the cat back there represents cholera and is expressing his fear that maybe the dogs will come after them. So you could do some political jokes in Japan. That was possible. But Kinikichiro Honda is going to make a joke about the Diet, the Japanese Congress, where he's critical. And that's going to lead to him, I'm sorry, not him, but his editor being thrown in jail for a time. So this has a chilling effect, right? We have to remember this. This is one thing that we don't see as much with Western comic artists, American comic artists. They're not getting thrown in jail, really, for their comics. But we have to remember in Japan, that is a fear that can happen to you. By the way, when this was going on, I should point out the Constitution was not yet in effect. Now, there's another very important person named Kitazawa Rakuten, who is also going to be influenced by Western drawings and Western comic art and Western techniques. And he's going to focus more on politics, as we saw previously with Japanese and early American editorial cartoons, right? A lot of cartooning, remember, comes out of political criticism. We saw that earlier when we were looking at the rise of American comics. But you can see here on the left, he has made his own puck, Tokyo Puck, right? Similar to, we'll go back to the Japan Punch, right? These are comics, Punch, Puck, that have come out of the West, and they're being influenced by this, right? So you have Tokyo Puck as well. And there you can see they are making fun of Teddy Roosevelt, in a sense. You maybe can't quite see it, but he's on his back is a mosquito that he's trying to reach, and he can't quite get at it, and that's meant to represent anti-Japanese feeling in California. Teddy Roosevelt was actually pretty pro-Japan, but he always had trouble because in California there was a lot of anti-Japanese feeling, and it's showing how, and he opposed it and did his best to stop California from doing that. But the United States, we have a federal system, right? The president can't just tell the states what to do. So this is kind of poking fun at that. By the way, images like this led the American ambassador to protest the how this was being presented in the Japanese media. But they weren't just making fun of American politics. You can see here kind of a comic on the right where you had this gigantic young woman. She's the daughter of those two Japanese parents below her, and she is holding up a book and that says sexual hygiene and how to, and then on the other page it says conception. So it's talking about modern sex education. And the joke in the comic is, you can't quite see the caption, but the caption says, she's talking to her parents, "What do you know about married life? You don't even know English." And again, it's kind of poking fun at how we Japanese are learning all this stuff from the West and maybe ignoring our own kind of traditions and customs. Now, these images that you find in Tokyo Puck, like I said, this is kind of editorializing, this is kind of satire. We're not yet to just like a funny comic. We are going to see more of that, though. Here's a couple images by the same guy, by Kitazawa Rakuten. On the left, I think it's kind of funny. Basically the idea, and it's numbered. Remember, a lot of the early Western cartoons were numbered, where you have this guy who he is with his wife, and their married life is really good. Notice he's come from a hard day at work, and she's massaging his feet. But in the second panel, they have a child, so, he's lost some space. Things are not great. He can't get his foot massaged anymore. Then they had their second child in panel 3, so now he's losing space, And on panel 4, he's been almost completely pushed off of the sofa and now is actually being put in charge of childcare by his wife. So it's making fun of kind of how gender relations are changing. On the right, you have an image which is getting pretty close to moving away from political satire to just a general comic. Now, this is a little complex because it reads from the right to the left and from up down. So the first comic strip for the first panel's in the upper right where the guy's letting the water out of the fire hydrant, or at least attempting to. In the second panel, he's trying to look up at it and saying, hey, where'd the water go? In the third panel on the bottom right, he's sticking out his tongue trying to get the water. In the fourth, they're still having trouble getting it out. Still in the fifth and the sixth, the guy turns on the water too hard and he splooshes the guy with lots of water. And it's making fun of country people who don't know how the city works. That's the joke. That's moving more away from political satire, right, to kind of social satire we've seen here. And eventually, what's going to happen is you're going to go from just having these kind of specialized magazines like Kitazawa Rakuten's Tokyo Puck, and those are, again, images that appeared in there by him, right? We're going to go from that to having just funnies. So you're going to, you may remember Bringing Up Father. That was one of the comics we looked at. Well, that's going to be brought into Japan and published with Japanese word balloons. And you can see on the right, it says King Feature Syndicate. Remember, we talked about earlier, if you could get syndicated, you could make a bunch of money because your work could be spread all over the place. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. And there you can see it's basically Bringing Up Father just in Japanese. But it doesn't take long from there to get a ripoff, right? Someone named Yutako Aso is going to make something called Easygoing Daddy, which is very, very similar in terms of what it's trying to do, right? It's going to be this kind of silly guy and the problems he has. And the joke here, and notice they're going to go more in a Western style now. They're going to go from left to right instead of right to left. So on the left, you have Easygoing Daddy. He's in charge of a radio show. And he said he's introducing this woman who's going to come in and sing. And on the right, you can see she's a terrible singer. It sounds like a train. And then the bottom left, it sounds like a storm, like it's awful. And then in the bottom right, his boss is saying, hey, you got to go back in there and continue the show. Not necessarily the most humorous thing, but you can see it's very closely connected to the humor, so-called, that we saw in Bringing Up Father. I'm just not a big fan of the strip. So you can see, though, how quickly the Japanese are going from being exposed to kind of these Western ideas and developing their own style. And that brings us then to the Four Immigrants manga. This is a really fascinating manga for a wide variety of reasons. In a sense, you could almost say it's the first manga because it's going to be an actual kind of comic book rather than something that's just being printed in a newspaper or a journal that happens to have comics in it. So the man there on the right is a guy named Henry Kiyama. Now, he was born in Japan. He wasn't given that name in Japan. That's a name he took when he went to the United States. But he had an interest in learning Western art. And the United States was a little bit easier than Europe to get to, a little bit cheaper. So he's going to go to the United States to learn Western art. And particularly, he goes to San Francisco. And there he'll work as a houseboy, like a servant, to make money in order to take art classes. And he will take Western art classes. He'll actually get quite good at Western art. And later on, he'll return to Japan, live his life there, and will continue drawing Western art, and will also have a little museum dedicated to him in his hometown because he did have a role in bringing Western art to Japan. Now, what he's going to do, though, is he's going to create a comic, kind of comic stripped, initially detailing the immigrant experience for Japanese people. Right? He's going to make this comic detailing the immigrant experience of Japanese people in a kind of comic strip form. And in 1927, when he gives an exhibit of his art, he is going to display that kind of art, which that comic. And that's really, in a sense, daring because he wanted to be a serious artist. And this time period, serious artists did not take comics seriously. So he was running the risk of kind of lowering his prestige. But in 1927, he'll start exhibiting that comic. In 1931, he'll have it printed in Japan and brought back to the United States, where the Japanese consul will praise it. If you're not familiar with the term, a consul is like a diplomatic official. They usually tend to be more interested in trade than political relations. But in any case, he's going to have this printed and in Japan bring it back to the United States. Had to do it in Japan, I believe, because it had Japanese language and written in the comic. I'll talk more about that momentarily. And Western people just couldn't print it easily at that time. The comic itself is really fascinating because, for one thing, is the issue of language. So the comic, when Henry Kiyama wrote the comic, he wrote it in mixed Japanese and English. So some of it's in Japanese, some of it's in English. So what happened was when they someone translated it into English so that you could read it, and I've assigned a part of this to read, the problem is, how do you translate that to English when there's already English there? And the way that the translator dealt with that, because he wanted to show how sometimes the Japanese guys were speaking in Japanese and sometimes they were speaking in English. What he did, the translator, was when you see something like printed, like with a, like just kind of, it looks like printing, that is that is Japanese. It's been translated in English. But when you see something that looks like it's drawn, like it's not like a regular font, like it's something someone drew, that was originally in English. Right. So if it looks kind of like, hand drawing, that was always in English. It wasn't translated. If you see something that's like printed, that was originally in Japanese. One thing that's really weird about this manga, I don't know if weird is the right term for it. There's some kind of harsh issues of race. I didn't include any of those in the excerpts because I'm going to deal with race another time. But I think it's kind of demeaning, but there are some kind of negative representations of African-American people there. And it's really weird. You would think that Henry Kiyama would maybe have a little bit more sympathy for other people who were facing racism, but it just doesn't appear here, which is unfortunate, I think. And I want to note that because it's there, but I just think it distracts from kind of the major point I just want to make about this, showing us about the importance of this kind of, Western and Japanese influence mixing together to make a manga. I don't want to distract from that, but I also don't want to pretend like it's not there, because it's totally there and it's kind of embarrassing. But we'll deal with more of that later. But through this series, through this lecture, you've been able to see how Japan was had its own artistic tradition, and how the West, particularly the United States, but also we saw through Bigot and Bergman, how the West is going to be bringing in new kinds of techniques that Japanese people will quickly adopt and adapt creatively to make their own kind of popular drawing culture.